Hey there, this is Fritz Westover, your viticulturist at Virtual Viticulture Academy and also with the Vineyard Underground podcast. And today I'm going to answer a question from a grower just like you. I'm going to answer a question from Don in Kentucky that came in during my live vineyard advising session. And he wants to know, is an acre really an acre? And as a grower of 11 years, there's something I've always wondered, he says, whether we are talking chemicals, fertilizers, or even crop yield, everything seems to be talked about by the acre, at least if you're in the Northern Hemisphere, here in the United States, that is. And depending on row and vine spacing, the number of physical vines on an acre of land can vary greatly. I was once told just to use the number 600 vines in an acre and adjust according to fit my plot of vines. Is there any truth to this? And how do you do it? Okay, great question, Don. Let's get into this and dig in and find out what we need to know about, are we comparing acres to acres or apples to apples or grapes to grapes? So number one, you mentioned that we have to talk in terms of per acre when we talk about sprayings, whether it's a fungicide, an insecticide. The next thing was about fertilization, treating an acre of land differently based on the number of vines per acre. And then the last one was basically on yield. So let's start with the first part on spraying your vineyard. So if you're applying, whether it's an organic product or a conventional product, if you're applying a product on your canopy, one of the confusing things is that all growers know that there is a rate per acre that is listed on the label, and the label's the law. So we know you can't exceed that rate of product per acre of land that you're spraying, but you're not spraying the acre of land, you're spraying the canopy that is in some acres going to be as much as 1,000 vines or more per acre, and on others, maybe less than 500 vines per acre. So your canopy size is going to be different. So when these products are tested, typically they're applied in research settings in 100 gallons of water per acre. And they're going to be on a standard, whether it's a high curtain or a vertical shoot position training system. So if you're spraying that canopy, the canopy size varies. The tests were done with 100 gallons per acre to make sure that the product totally saturated and got all of the leaves, the fruit, to know that it's working. The reality is, though, in most vineyards, at least ones that I work with, that are, let's say, on a vertical shoot position canopy or a simple high wire trellis, they're really not going to apply more than about 50 gallons, maybe 70 gallons per acre on a full canopy. And to complicate things more, when the canopy is smaller, let's say maybe 2 or 3 weeks after bud burst, you have a very small canopy, only 12 inches tall. You're not going to put on all the nozzles on your sprayer. You're only going to use the nozzles that target that part of the canopy where there's actually something to spray, the short canopy. So what I typically do with my growers is I tell them that early in the season, the number one rule is don't exceed the labeled rate per acre. And then number two, you're probably going to want to apply a concentration of the product that represents a full rate per acre. Now, there are exceptions. When you talk about fertilizers that you're spraying, phosphorus acid products for downy mildew, or things like oxidate or JMS stylet oil for powdery mildew, those tend to be concentration based. So sometimes they give you a concentration just like they would with an herbicide, where they say it's a 1% of solution or 0.5% of solution. And you have to stay true to that and just make sure you don't exceed any maximum rate per acre listed on the label for your crop. So that's one part of it. But the other products tend to be a little more vague. They tend to be 5 ounces per acre or a pound per acre. So how do you treat that? Well, number one, you don't exceed the rate per acre max. And number two, you have to figure out how much water you need to cover your canopy. So technically, if early in the season, you only need 20 gallons of water to cover your 1 foot long shoots with 1 or 2 nozzles on each side of the row, you might only mix that 5 ounces or 1 pound with 20 gallons of water. But the reality is it's probably too concentrated or high of a concentration of the product that is needed, because during the normal growing season, if you're spraying 50 gallons with that 5 ounces or 1 pound and it's working well, you probably don't need a higher concentration than that. So early in the season, technically, and this is not direct advice to you, but this is observation about what a lot of growers are doing, is that you could mix per 50 gallons of water, if you know you're going to spray 25 per acre early in the season, the full acreage rate on the label. And that's going to give you a concentration that you know during the full season is going to be suitable for protecting your crop. And what might happen is you might apply that 50 gallons over 2 acres, and thereby you would save some cost on product. And so that is something that growers are doing. And then once you get up to your 50 gallons per acre, when your canopy is full size, you put in that max rate per 50 gallons and you end up spraying 1 acre with 50 gallons. Now, what if you need 60 gallons to get good coverage? I'm not going to go into defining what good coverage is. I think you know if you're getting good coverage, or at least I hope you do, and you're testing for it. But if you need 60 gallons to get good coverage of your fruit and foliage during the peak of your growing season, or let's say from veraison to harvest, then you're going to put the top labeled rate per acre in 60 gallons of water. Because if you put it in 50 and spray 60, you're going to overspray and exceed the maximum labeled rate per acre, which we don't want. So think of it in terms of your canopy size, and knowing if you know how many gallons per acre you're putting out to cover that canopy properly, then you can use the numbers and go from there. But I find that 50-gallon rule of thumb early in the season works well because most of the tests were done initially using 100 gallons per acre. So if you're putting a max labeled rate in 50 gallons, you're definitely getting a concentration that must be better than what was tested with the product initially. Again, follow the label. The label's the law. I'm simply giving you some insights on what I see growers doing and how that might even save them some money or product use in the beginning of the season when the canopy is small. Now, in terms of fertilization, a lot of times, if we're applying a foliar fertilizer, you're using the same kind of rules that I mentioned for a foliar spray with your other products. But most of the time, the foliar fertilizers are concentration based, just like that phosphorus acid is, just like that oxidate or JMS stylet oil. So you don't want to exceed too much of a concentration, or you could cause burn on your canopy. But the tricky part is, and the label will help you with that. It'll tell you usually per 50 gallons or 100 gallons or per acre what you can add. So if a product says 1 to 2 quarts of this foliar fertilizer per acre, if you're spraying a low volume like 50 gallons, you might start with 1 quart and then work your way up to 2 quarts if you find that you have no damage and it's safe to do. That's a little trial and error. But when it comes to putting fertilizer on the ground, this is where knowing your vines per acre can really help out. If it's a small vineyard, oftentimes, if someone's just putting out a little bit of triple 13 fertilizer, just for an example, that's 13% nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. You put that on the ground and we'll typically say, oh, put 2 ounces or 3 ounces around the base of the vine. Don't clump it in a ball, spread it out. So it's really going to drip into the soil when the next rain event comes. And you really do want rain to come in and wash that soil fertilizer or work that fertilizer into the soil. And that can work really well. But when you have a large vineyard and it's not practical to just put a small amount of fertilizer at the base of each vine, even though that could be efficient in terms of fertilizer use, it's not efficient in terms of how you're applying it. So if your preference is to broadcast, we'll use again the example, the triple 13 fertilizer. If you're broadcasting it over the whole soil surface using a cone spreader with your tractor, okay, you may actually want to be fertilizing the grass between the rows, as well as the area under the vines that the vine roots are primarily growing in. If that's the case, you're probably going to use a little higher rate of fertilizer because you're trying to feed the grass and under the vines. So if a normal, let's say, I'm going to use a benchmark. Maybe your objective is 20 pounds of actual nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium per acre. And that's in the triple 13. That means for every 100 pounds per acre of triple 13 you apply, you get 13 pounds of nitrogen, 13 pounds of phosphorus, and 13 pounds of potassium. So if your goal was 20, that means we're going to need just under 200 pounds per acre to get that rate into the soil and hopefully have it rained in and worked in so we don't lose any nitrogen to volatilization in the heat and sun, things like that. So you would do that. But if you're only going to apply that nitrogen just under the vine row, you probably don't want to apply 100 or even 200 pounds per acre because that was a rate that was intended for applying over the entire surface of the soil. And right now, you're really just trying to fertilize a narrow strip where the majority of your roots are underneath the vine row. So you could cut the rate in half or cut it to a third of the normal rate you would apply as a broadcast, but you definitely need to cut it back because you might end up over fertilizing under the vine row, and that could cause other unintended consequences of high vigor or issues with maturing fruit or shading. If you get too much nitrogen in that canopy and get water added to it, it's going to explode. So these are things to keep in mind. You do have to adjust your fertilizer rate based on your method of application. If you have a drip injector and you're putting the fertilizer through your irrigation, then it's going to be an even smaller amount of fertilizer because it's going right to the roots. And not only is it going to the roots, it's being pushed to the roots with the irrigation water. So I find when I make my recommendations for fertilizer for vineyards that are irrigated and have an injector for the fertilizer, we can apply much, much lower rates, even much lower than we would apply if we were tossing a handful of fertilizer on the ground. So efficiency goes up by understanding these things. And then finally, yield. You really can't compare yield in a vineyard I'm going to use feet because we're talking acres and feet here. If there's a vineyard with 8 feet between rows and 4 feet between vines, we have over 1,000 vines per acre. If it's on 10 feet between rows and 6 feet between vines, we're getting closer to half that. So it's a different number of vines. And as we know, vines are going to need to be in balance. So if you have the same amount of fruit per vine, but you have more vines per acre, right? Then you surely could ripen or a larger tonnage per acre on the closer spaced vines. It's just how it works. Now, of course, there's other things you need to tease into the equation, like your canopy size, your canopy health. But you really, I guess the main point is you can't look at a neighbor's vineyard that's on completely different spacing than yours, even if it's the same variety, rootstock, training system, everything else. You can't compare your yields to their yields if your vine spacing is different. So what everyone really needs to do is understand what yields they can sustainably produce so they're not overstressing the vines, so they still have good wine quality. And this is a little bit of a trial and error. And growers are constantly working through these trial and error experiences to learn what they can do to maximize their crop without hurting the longevity of the vineyard or ruining wine quality. But my main point is don't compare apples and oranges. We want to compare grapes with grapes. So it's important to know how your spacing affects what you're doing versus your neighbor's vineyard. So Don, I hope this is helpful and gave you some insights on what to look for when you're not only spraying or fertilizing, but just comparing yields with other growers. Check back in sometime and ask another question. For those of you who want to find where you can ask a question, go to a Vineyard Underground podcast, click the Ask Fritz button, and you can send a question to me. Also, you can visit virtualviticultureacademy.com and peruse through all of the free grower guides and other video content that's there. I'd love to see you there. And I'm wearing my shirt today that says, teach everything you know, because that's what I love to do. Don't hold anything back. And if you join us in the academy sometime, you'll see that we're talking with growers all over the world and answering questions for growers just like you. So take care and see you next time.